The sexual integrity will be up here, and the anxiety and depression one will be down in the fellowship hall. So after we sing, we'll just split up into you. Hopefully, you know where you're going. So we're going to be singing Psalm 119. Also, actually, real quick, sorry. I wanted to just kind of go through the rest of the schedule. After this talk will be a fellowship time, and it will be the last. We need you to turn in your question and answers at the end of the talk because we're going to be organizing them during that time. So the bin's up here. If you have any questions for creation, and then there's 3x5 cards by bin. So please turn those in.
My creative juices will not flow until I get inspiration from hearing other people's questions. Are we going to be able to ask questions in real time?
We're going to have a live mic. You just don't get to be anonymous. The only reason we did it in writing is because some people might need to ask questions.
Yeah, so anonymous ones can go in, and even ones you would think of now, there'll be a live mic for that. So we'll have fellowship time, and then we'll have the question and answer, and then we'll say our goodbyes. And then there will be a survey to fill out during that time. So, do you have a question? What? Bethany? Oh, there's a lot of extra, well, I don't know how much, but there's extra soup. So if you're driving a long way and want to get lunch, because we're going to end probably
All right. On the home stretch, forgive me, I'm a little slow starting. We did 2 back-to-back, so I'm switching notes on my computer and so forth. All right.
I'm recording it for somebody going downstairs. Do you mind if I?
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. I think it's also going to be online, like on YouTube. So, okay, yeah, it'll be on YouTube. So you can, but I don't think you need to. Okay, so we're on the home stretch, and by far we are at the most complex of the 3 talks that we did in large format. Sexual integrity in a hypersexualized world. This one was actually, ironically, not one topic that I picked. It was picked by the women in the presbytery. There was a lot of saying this is not an issue that's being addressed within our respective churches. And not only is it not being addressed, we don't really know where to go to get it to be addressed. And as it happens, when they were like, so would you be willing to have this conversation? I was like, I think y'all have come to the right gal. So this falls squarely within my wheelhouse. Not only as a mental health professional am I a marriage and family counselor, as opposed to mental health writ large. I focus on couples, families, and systems. But beyond that, I've done a tremendous amount of specialization, postmaster's work, to be really niched into this particular topic. I've got about between 2,000 and 3,000 postmaster's hours specifically in the area of sex and sex-related stuff. So this is a broad topic, and I think it's interesting when you tell people that you're a sex therapist, they don't know what that means. So I'm going to start by saying you probably don't know what it means, and it probably conjures up a lot of different ideas. But primarily what I do is I address a whole variety of concerns that address and impact. I talk about sexuality and aging a lot. I do a tremendous amount of work with sexual trauma and how that impacts the lived experience, how it impacts the marital bond, how it impacts all other domains of functioning. I do a lot of work with folks who are struggling with pornography or other embodied addictive or compulsive behaviors in the area of sex and sexuality. I do a lot of work coaching couples on how to communicate at a basic level. How do we talk openly, constructively, honestly? What does that dialogue look like? How do we have it? When do we have it? What's important to include in it? Now, we're not during our time going to be going through this, but if you look in the packet I gave you, there is an inventory. And that inventory is designed for, to be used within the context of a marriage, or with somebody else moderating, it can constructively be used in pre-engagement or premarital contexts. So we won't be using that, but I would encourage you to look at it and use it as a resource, or if you feel like that's not a resource you need, you probably know somebody for whom it's going to be a great resource, and maybe they do need that. All right, with kind of those things out of the way, when I was asked to talk about this particular topic, like what does sexual integrity look like, I really, really struggled, because I feel like within the church, if I was to be asked, like, what is it like, in particular in a role like mine, what is it like in a broader church context to have a discussion about issues relating to sex? And the best way I can describe it is, imagine if from the pulpit your pastor was like, we are going to do a sermon series on food in the Bible. And then they came up and they were like, I'd like to talk about eating disorders. I'd also like to talk about famine and fighting over resource to produce food. I'd like to talk about gluttony. I'd like to talk about every conceivable abuse that food can be put to. And then like the last 10 minutes of a 10-part series was like, also food's delicious and sometimes feasting happens. This is what the sex dialogue in the church is like. We want to talk about everything we're not supposed to do. We want to talk about all of the ways that it goes wrong. We want to talk about all of the ways that it constitutes risk. We want to talk about meaningful harm. We want to talk about abuse. We want to talk about trauma. But you want to know what we don't want to talk about? We don't want to talk about how to have a constructive dialogue about, like, what's good about it. Like, we don't. Like, everybody starts getting real interested in their shoelaces when that starts coming around, and people start squirming in their seats. And so what we have is we have a social context within the church that primarily looks at sexual integrity as a series of prohibitives, right? Don't do these things. Don't until you're married. Once you're married, don't outside of this one context. Once you're in that context, only that context. Don't. Don't look at these things. Don't do these other things. Don't do those things. What we don't know how to do is have an affirmational discussion, like what positively, what constructively, what healthfully, what in a holy way can I do to be thinking about, understanding, and processing through what it is like to be an embodied person that may or may not, during various phases of life, be participating in an embodied sex life. Like, that's a really, like, when's the last time that you had just a rocking conversation about that with, like, your clergy or a member of your session or an older woman in the congregation that you felt like you could trust? Like, when's the last time you were like, we can talk about this, this is great? Anybody have that? I live here. That's not fair, Em. Em's like, we talk. Em's like, we. Okay, but if we look around, there's, one's like, well, I talked to you about it. We've had that conversation. And you're like, okay. So the vast majority of us, we don't have these conversations. And here's the thing. It's not just that we don't have them. It's not like we don't have them because, like, we're good. I actually have clarity. I don't need that conversation. Mostly, if you wanted to have the conversation, do you know where you'd park it to begin with? Right? I think most people don't. And if you do, when I look at the numbers of couples I deal with, many, probably like 60% are intra-church. Most of them don't know. They don't even know where to park it. So I think one of the reasons they don't know where to park it is because we don't want to talk about it. And the other reason is because somewhere down deep, I think we have this longing to have that positive affirmational dialogue. And the people that we know we could go by role and talk to, we're really worried that they're not going to show up in that positive frame of mind. And so we're kind of terrified to even bring it to the people that we could bring it to. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to be shut down or shot down or chastised or shamed. And so we don't know even where to go to have a free-range, broad, expansive dialogue that doesn't basically just resort to, here's all the stuff you shouldn't do. If you're doing it, stop it. Right? So I have a big overarching premise about this discussion. And believe it or not, most of my discussion isn't going to be about it. It's going to be about how we think and talk about it. Because the big payoff isn't the discussion we have here today. The big payoff in my mind is starting a dialogue that spreads so that there can be places to have these conversations, real-time, face-to-face, contextualized by community. Because here's what we know. In particular with younger couples and younger members of the church, if they don't have a warm, safe, constructive, thoughtful, non-shamey, non-icky place to park the dialogue, where do they start going to look for the dialogue? They go to the internet. Has anybody tried to look for constructive sex information on? Okay, so as a therapist, I have, and you do not want to know what comes in my inbox, right? Like, it's garbage on garbage on garbage. And so going to the internet is terrible. The other thing is, if you don't go to the internet, what they'll do is they'll go to their friends, but not their church friends, right? So now they're having a face-to-face dialogue, and that dialogue is impactful, right? Because I feel breathing room to have the talk with you at all. And so now I'm going to be very much shaped by that dialogue because you were willing to show up and have it at all. But you don't have my values, right? But you don't make me feel gross about what I struggle with. You don't make me feel gross about what I think. You don't make me feel gross about what I've done. So now you've got tremendous influence in my life, even though we don't agree on the values. So I want to say that the first thing we should think about when we think about sexual integrity is, where do we go to talk about it at all? Who do we talk to about it with? How often are we willing to be open? Are we willing to initiate, and are we willing to have other people initiate with us? And if you kind of think people might need to have it, and you think they don't have the momentum to initiate, are you willing to graciously initiate so that they can at least hear it? Because they didn't know how to ask for it, or because they were afraid of all of the negative responses that might come their way and historically have come their way. So sexual integrity begins with asking yourself, who do I talk to, when, and why? How do I know? How do I know when I need to talk to somebody about these things, right? And I think most of the time, we just avoid the whole thing altogether. We just don't know who to talk to. And we don't want to talk to them anyway, so it's easier to obscure the whole thing. So sexual integrity begins with having open, honest, consistent, transparent dialogues with other people inside the communities that share the faith values we hold. Where else can we go to norm and level set such a deeply personal and profound part of our lives? I actually think it is a travesty that the church is the last place people want to go to talk about this. I think we should be people out there that are more willing than anybody. We are eager, we are anticipating, we are ready, we are super prepared, we are over prepared. We want this dialogue in-house. So why don't we? Like, if you guys are all like, yeah, that makes sense. So why don't we? And I actually think that there are two primary reasons why we don't. I think the first reason why we often don't is we don't want to look like the secular world. We don't want to look dirty. So one of the ways to not look dirty is to kind of not talk about the dirty things, right? We can distance. We create space because by not talking about the gross things, the nasty things, the hard things, the difficult things, by not engaging with those things, we get a certain perception that we're above the fray. We're not sullied in the same way the culture is, because we were, the title of the talk is Sexual Integrity in a Hypersexualized World. So, right, the world outside is hypersexualized. A great way to distinguish us from them, from that hypersexualized context, is just not talk about it that much, because if we're not talking about it that much, then we're not hypersexualized, right? Because we're not hyper talking about it, we're not hyper thinking about it, right? So we have this illusion that by not talking about it, we stay above the fray, we stay distant, we don't get confused with the heathen masses who are obsessed with talking about it, right? I think the second reason we avoid the dialogue is we don't want to be forced to the posture of humility that it would require, because the vast majority of us are not paragons of great, constructive, healthy sexuality. We've got hang-ups about our bodies, we've got hang-ups about the activity, we've got hang-ups about our partner, we've got histories, we've got past sins, we've got past sins against us. And I think the reality is, one of the big reasons we don't want to talk about it is because to talk about it would mean being open and transparent and having to process and deal with and confront my own garbage in this department. And I think mostly, if we could avoid that, that sounds like a great deal. I think most of us don't want to be transparent. We don't even want to be transparent with ourselves, let alone somebody else. We're happy to leave this in a very, very, very obscure realm. So these are the reasons why we avoid. And I think they're, I understand, right? They make sense to me at a gut level as a woman inside the Christian orbit. I get why we would want to avoid. It feels easier, it feels safer, it feels, in some sense, more moral in some occasions to be above that fray and not in that, lubricious dialogue. It's so gross and icky and sticky, and we want to not feel like we're ensnared in that. But let's talk about the real and meaningful impacts of not getting into it. When we don't get into it, what we find is we go to the internet, we go to our peers, and what is the net impact of going to the internet and going to our peers? And the answer is porn, erotica, romance novels that are trashy, fan fiction, and then swap and slag with peer groups. This is what, like, I'm not making this, the data tells us that this is where children, this is where young adults, this is where young marrieds inside the church are going to get their conversation about this, right? And maybe we don't know how bad that is. Like, everybody is like, yeah, it's probably bad. Like, we've been told, like, you know, lust in your heart, Sermon on the Mount, it's bad, right? Like, we know that, sure. But let's talk about this. There's some great data. Women that engage in use of it, and this is gonna be one of the three, either romance novels, pornography, or erotica. Like, I'm just gonna drop some data. Longitudinal studies of men and women report increased depression and anxiety. Are we noticing themes? When we work out of grain, we find that we don't work well. Longitudinally, which is to say that when you stop, the impacts don't stop. There's inertia. It dominoes, sometimes for years, until you deal with what's in your head, okay? Self-esteem. Women and men experience tremendous destruction. They have body dysmorphia. Women, disproportionately more than men, report shame, feelings of shame, when they engage with these particular kinds of media. Among adolescents in particular, broadly speaking, not just anxiety and depression, overall matrices of emotional regulation go haywire with early onset. And speaking of early onset, anybody want to hazard a guess, average age of first porn exposure? Close. It's 8 if you have an older sibling. If you don't have an older sibling, it's 10. But if an older sibling has a phone, it's 8. 8-year-olds, right? Like 10-year-old. I got a 10-year-old. Oh, right? Okay, and what we find with them is it's not just anxiety, it's not just depression. It short circuits broadly. And so they lose and have diminished overall emotive regulation issues. They are less able to self-regulate, broadly speaking, with early onset exposure. So when we distance ourselves and stay above the fray, we set, in particular, the youngest among us up for an unspeakably difficult road to sexual health and holiness. We give them down chain, by far the hardest lot to live out, because those effects domino forward, right? Trust is diminished. Overall romantic sentiment and positive regard is diminished. It leads to higher rates of conflict in marriages and in intimate partner relationships. It leads to self-objectification. I am more inclined to see my worth, purpose, and meaning through the lens of what I look like visually and what I can offer sexually. This is where I hinge my purpose, my meaning, my value. Writ large, but to men or other women in some instances in particular, right? There are negative psychological impacts. You are much more likely to be in or instigate coercion, harassment, and infidelity. So your rates of marital infidelity are higher with pornography use. Also, other acts of physical aggression are higher. What we see when we leave a world to its own devices, to the wisdom of the internet uncontextualized by person-to-person relationship in a value-based context, what we see is, it's like judges, everybody doing what's right in their own eye, right? We take more risks, right? And that's just with pornography, and here's what's great. These dominoes sequentially fall. When we absent ourselves from the dialogue and we go to these things, that sets the stage for the next phase of this, which is people that do all of those things. In addition to all of those negative outcomes, they're exponentially more likely as they grow up in late adolescence forward to engage in casual sex, high-risk sex, and diverse other forms of sex, because these are things that they discovered through the wisdom of the internet, right? So here we are. And now we look at, so what are the negative impacts of casual sex, right? We get increased rates of STDs, right? But we also get increased rates of substance abuse. People who engage, in particular women that engage in high degrees of transactional sexual relationships are at high risk for developing substance abuse issues. So because we didn't want to have that uncomfortable dialogue, and we didn't want to deal with our own baggage, and we wanted to look holy, when they're younger, they porn. And then when they get a little bit older, we domino into this other thing. And why wouldn't we, right? They've normalized, they've acclimated, this is the safe place to admit I have these feelings, I think about these things, I don't know where else to park them. So we domino. And we set them up for disease, we set them up for substance abuse. We set them up for sequential partnering. We set them up for suicidality. We set them up for feelings of loneliness and regret. These things are pervasive. Diminished self-esteem. I can send out the studies. But sexual integrity begins with engaging in a consistent, open, constructive, value-based, faith-oriented dialogue about what sex is, what it's designed to accomplish, and how do we know how to use it well, constructively, and properly, right? So let's say that we are one of those people that don't have the checkered past, right? We're pretty stable. And so there isn't that embarrassment, and we feel like we can just kind of step right in. We still find that we don't, right? Even absent those hang-ups, we find that people just aren't willing and eager to engage. But even if we don't have those checkerings, we find that there's reserve, and here is what I think happens. This is my best guess. By the way, this is not evidentially supported. This is just as a result of being in the room with couple after couple after couple over a series of years. Here's my best guess as to what's going on. Even if all of those sins have been avoided and we have a sense that within the Christian context we have been unscathed by all of the sins that beset this area of life, the vast, vast, vast majority of us have not bothered to educate ourselves thoughtfully and well, even if we're not in the area of sin. And here's what I mean. We might not have done any of the bad things we're not supposed to do, but we probably haven't affirmationally pursued a healthy, happy, flourishing, satisfying sex life. We don't even know what that looks like most of the time. And I'm not saying that in ignorance. I can't tell you how many couples come to me and the woman says, I think I'm broken. Like I think my body's broken. Or maybe I psychologically, secretly don't like maybe I'm frigid. And I will ask them, why? Why would you think this? And even though, right, like this isn't a couple that's been untainted, right? They got through childhood, they got through dating and courtship, they did it all right. And then it's like, okay, so untainted. Still, the cultural context they live in, they have breathed in the ether these assumptions about what their body's designed for, how it's designed to function, what a man's body does, what it's designed to function as. And so they have these expectations that aren't rooted in facts or data or information at all. And it starts, like, even if you don't watch gross movies, like even watching a PG-13 rom-com, right? The average sex scene in a movie lasts 45 seconds. Any woman here think that that's even vaguely representative of a healthy sexual experience for you as a woman? But if that's all you've ever seen, and we, in an effort to be unsullied, have not mixed it up, what else are you supposed to think? right? So we have knowledge gaps. So the second component I would assert in sexual integrity isn't just be willing to have the dialogue. It's educate yourself. Be willing to get an education. Not everybody has to do the kind of you do not want to know all this. I don't even want to know all the stuff I know. I have sat in lectures that I wish I could like scrub up out my brain. There's stuff I know that I don't think everybody needs to know, but there's some basic stuff that most women and most men don't know. There's knowledge gaps. They don't understand basic issues of functionality. So be humble and be willing to learn the basic fundamental information so that when you step into those dialogues, you can be a legitimate, valuable, and thoughtful resource to those around you. Does that make sense? So a little bit of physiology goes a long way. A little bit of psychology, a little bit of understanding the way men and women differentially think about physical and sexual intimacy is super, super helpful, right? So these are things that we can do to be pursuing integrity. We can be pursuing and open to dialogue. We can be pursuing and open to real, legitimate, data-driven education. So we have resources to give, and we can be a safe place so that people don't have to go to the internet. And not only that, let's assume you've got filters and somebody gets really, really good information. Like the data's clean, good data. Data uncontextualized isn't that great, right? Like, how do I morally compass and orient myself in this space? That probably requires the wisdom of an elder brother or sister in faith to help me contextualize just that glut of data. So even when we go best case scenario and we don't see aberrant exposures, we don't see aberrant behaviors, what we then have is just like people that know a lot but don't know how to sort, sift, comprehend, process, and move through, right? And then I would say, let's start deliberately and intentionally cultivating in our own lives a coherent perspective on sexuality that is primarily based on pursuing health and wholeness, and what does that look like at different phases, as opposed to assuming that default phase where we believe that sexual integrity is a list of do's and don'ts. So instead of holding on to this idea that the do's and don'ts are where we find integrity, I posit that asking ourselves, whatever phase of life we are in, what does sexual integrity look like for me real time in this part of my life, is a way that your life becomes a lived example of what integrity looks like in whatever that phase is, right? So what does sexual integrity look like over the lifespan, right? That's a hard question to ask when the default has been like, well, just don't and let's not talk about it, right? So I think when we look at folks that are unmarried, whether they are widowed, whether they are young and never married, whether they are divorced and in a state of singleness, what does sexual integrity look like for these people? And I think the honest answer looks like having an apparatus for extended, consistent, and deep accountability. But it's not just accountability to not do. It's accountability to contemplate, where am I headed, and how can I maintain a high and holy view of self? How can I maintain a high and holy view of what I'm designed for relationally? And how can I maintain a high and holy view of marriage as an institution so that I have positive, good, healthy, life-giving reasons to hold a standard at all? Mostly, we don't know where to go to have those. Single people don't know where to park a conversation about desire. They don't know where to park conversations about past sin. They don't know where to park a conversation about present sin, present stumbles. And is it a stumble sliding into a lifestyle, or is it a stumble sliding? Where do we park these discussions, right? If you're pursuing integrity as an unmarried adult, integrity looks a lot like affirmational accountability. I need people I can talk to about what I'm moving towards and why those things are deeply, deeply important. Why settling for less than the design, the God-given design, is bad for me. And the data is out there. Do you guys know that it's actually bad for you? Women are uniquely bad at casual sex at a biochemical level. Oxytocin is what gets released when a woman breastfeeds, like she bonds to her baby. Women also release that same hormone when they have sex or when they engage in sexualized activity. So women think, well, I can just kind of maybe do things, maybe have a line short of crossing the everything but. I can do these things and I can do them safely. I can do them like, well, I'm not at risk for getting pregnant. I'm not at risk for STD. Like, I can do these things. And what's happening is your biochemistry is writing checks that you don't want to cash, right? And this leads to unimaginable sense of rejection, negative self-image, inability to bond effectively, even in marital context moving forward. All of that happens when you capitulate, even at a not all the way level of physical engagement. And it happens the first time, right? Like, you don't have to be doing this for decades for that oxytocin to be happening, right? 6 seconds of kissing. So imagine what extended other thing, right? Like, all of the things that we don't talk about shy of doing it. All those things start to bond a woman to literally any man. And they don't have to choose it. It's the free gift with purchase, you know what I mean? Like, it just comes along for the ride. So we lie to ourselves in a single context about how far we can take, and we engage in brinksmanship to a stunning degree. But the reality is most single people don't have a place to be like, so I'm mentally toying with, or I'm struggling with, or I recently did. Who's gonna have those conversations? Who are you gonna talk to about that stuff? So they go to the internet and they go to their non-church buddies because they can't think of a member in their congregation to go to be like, so here's what I did, or here's what I kind of want to do, or here's what I know I don't want to do, but can we talk about how heavy it is when all my peers are to not? Can we talk about the emotive toll of being the only one in my peer set that is making this and taking this path? So sexual integrity for the single person looks a lot like having an ongoing byline of dialogue that kind of has two train tracks. One is the negative accountability, and the other is looking at what I'm designed for and finding those that you can be encouraged by to stick to and work in line with that good God-given design. That's what integrity looks like, pursuing what your design tells you to pursue in a context of other people that know how hard it is to hold those boundaries and are willing to hear your complaints and your laments and your longings and your frustrations. Because without it, people are unwilling. They end up in my office. They end up in their pastor's office. They end up in very, very far-flung places because they're desperate to have a place to say, does somebody see me in this? Right? It's unimaginably cruel to leave your single people out in the cold. To dehumanize, to depersonalize, to minimize the weight of those things puts them at such high risk. It's needlessly cruel. And we do it all the time. So let's talk about people that are courting or dating. What does sexual integrity look like there? Because it's not like it gets any easier, right? So you have this hope that you're going to stop being single and you're going to have a consistent place to park this. So what does integrity look like there? And the answer is substantially the same as singleness, and here's what I mean. Right now, we and the broader church have the most broken model of moving towards marriage I can possibly contemplate. It's literally designed for failure in every possible matrix. Dating is a morally bankrupt system. The idea that we are going to send too young in life, if it's under 24 and he's a man, his frontal lobe is, which is where all the impact and restraint and big high reasoning is, under 24, none of that's even developed. We're going to send him alone with a young woman who, when we look at young women structurally, we know that they are uniquely, even at that age, they're uniquely empathic the way adult women are, but their frontal lobes aren't as rock solid as they might be either. So that makes them so suggestible to social want and social pressure and the wants and needs of others. So we're gonna take a dude with no impact thinking and let him hang out alone with somebody who's predisposed to be really responsive to the expectations and pressures of other people. And then we're gonna let them vet one another for permanent life together. We do this inside the church. And I think we do it because we don't want to feel like Little House on the Prairie folk because courtship sounds old and matronly. But I want to tell you, if you value the young women in your life, start talking now about switching from dating to courtship. And so here's the thing. When you transition from life of the mind to embodied contact with people of the opposite sex, you don't need less accountability, you need more, and a whole lot of it. And here's the thing, I don't think we need accountability because we want to be like, don't, it's terrible, it's bad, it's awful. I think the reason we need accountability is so that we can be honest when we're like, it's good, it's amazing, which is precisely why it's important you don't mess it up for you or for them, right? This isn't about what you can say no to, it's about what you need to say yes to, what you were designed to say yes to. You're designed to say yes to this. And if you do all that other stuff, you are blighted, you are diminished, and you are under-resourced to do this well. Your ability to connect, your ability to bond, your ability to resource your marriage is diminished when you do these other things, when those online dominoes fall, and then when those in-person dominoes fall in the life of a single person because they think they're moving towards being able to marry. It's unspeakably cruel to not admit to the young courting folks in your congregation how profoundly good these things are, which is precisely why restraint and context matter more, not less. What are we saying yes to when we court? And why are we courting at all, right? And then the other thing is, okay, let's say we have that. We're casting the affirmational vision, right? And we've got that couple that they made it through unscathed. They're pretty good, they're pretty insulated, they're pretty solid. And they're ready to move into marriage. Sexual integrity looks a lot like cultivating a skill set that will allow you to communicate about this with your marital partner over time. That's hard. And I'll tell you what, it's uniquely hard for women. Culturally, women are disincentivized. I think within the church, we're even more we're quite diminished. I think that there is a perception that sex in marriage is primarily for men and about men. And for women, we're asking questions about like submission. We're asking questions about duty. And then if we're real nice, sometimes we're asking questions about like, shouldn't hurt, right? We're doing pain management, right? Like these are the people that end up in my office. This is not rare at all, right? Women and men coming in, and he's like, what's wrong with her? This is supposed to be like, we did all the things right, and this is supposed to be amazing. Is she broken? What's going on? And she comes in and is like, am I broken? Is he broken? What's going on? There's all this shame and blame surrounding it, and so much of it is knowledge gap. And the reason why we don't know what we don't know is because we didn't even know that we needed to talk about it. And if we talked about it, we could uncover the knowledge gaps, and then we could like educate ourselves out of knowledge gaps. But we don't even talk about it enough to know what we don't know, right? So sexual integrity in the courtship phase involves accountability and casting that good vision, and then it involves teaching people to be humble enough to learn, be humble enough to listen, and be bold enough to communicate openly about what's going on inside of them, right? And I can't tell you how many people have been married for years and they've never had a conversation. Like not one. married people in the church will come to me and I'll ask basic questions. Basic questions. Has your wife ever had an orgasm? I think so. What do you mean you think so? Well, I mean, I never really asked her. What do you mean you never asked her? Well, I thought that'd be rude. I didn't want to pry. Okay, so you can do this thing, but you can't query about your efficacy in doing the thing? This is insane. So if you're in a phase where you're thinking, I'm old enough to be married, part of being old enough to be married is being old enough to stare somebody face to face and say, here's what I like, or here's what I think I like, or here's what I'd like to try, or here's things that I'm pretty sure that I never want to try. Right? We don't even have these conversations at all. We have no basic education about anatomy, about physiology, about psychology, right? And what I can tell you is reliably, there are 5 issues. I do a whole lecture on 5 issues. Most marital sexual issues can be reduced down to 5 areas of divergence. I'm gonna give them to you. If you want a lecture on that, have your pastor invite me, I'll come talk about it. So the 5 areas where we see disparity is desire frequency gap. One partner is interested at a different rate from the other partner, okay? And by the way, it's not always the dude that wants it more. This is another area. That common misconception has led to all kinds of people in and up in my office. One partner, sometimes the woman, has a different speed than the other partner, okay? Then we have the difference between spontaneous and active desire and responsive desire. Overwhelmingly, this one is sex-linked, but not always. But like 90% of the time, you're going to see women having what is called responsive desire. And responsive desire looks a lot like, I would like to be pursued now. That idea sounds good. Like, I don't want to do anything, but I'm pretty excited about the idea of somebody else getting me to a place where I want to do a thing, okay? Most men, on the order of 90%, have what is known as spontaneous desire. And that looks a lot like, I'm standing around, changing the oil on my car, and I go, I like to have sex. That's spontaneous desire, like apropos of nothing, I'm lifing, and then I go, oh yeah, that thing. Most women, throughout their entire lifespan, will never have that. When women do, we see some during the puberty burst, and then some during the premenopausal phase, that kind of last ditch effort to reproduce before you lose reproductive viability. Those are the phases where we are most likely to see women at the hormonal level being driven to spontaneous desire. But apart from those phases of life, it's like 0. I mean, not actual 0, but like really 0, right? Statistically, it's so small, it's a rare number. Now, if you are that woman, no shame in your game, sister friend. I'm just saying that that gap between you and your partner constitutes a conversation we need to have, right? Because if I, as a man, have watched one too many things on the internet, I've been led to believe that this is what feminine desire presents as. And it's nothing like the responsive desire that's natural to most women, right? So we've got frequency, we've got presentation of desire. Then we've got the multitasker-unitasker gap, and this is also a sex-linked gap. So a guy has spontaneous desire, he's sitting there changing his oil, he's like, yeah, that sounds great. And men unitask, which is to say men on average will think about one thing at a time. Women, on average, are not unitaskers, they're multitaskers. And this is where we see expectations really leading to conflict in marriages. And what I mean by that is, if a man has spontaneous desire and he communicates that desire to his wife, and his wife responds positively and is like, well, when you get home. And then when he gets home as a unitasker, it's linear and direct. And then the wife's like, yeah, as soon as the dishes are done and the kids are put in bed and the books are put on the shelf, and as soon as all these things are done, then we can do this thing. And they're like, I thought you said you wanted to do that. Oh, no, I do. The man feels jerked around and the woman feels invisible because we don't know how to talk about how there is a moderated expression of interest even when the interest is shared. Most women don't know how to focus deeply and well when they got too many bogeys on their radar. So if you don't clear my radar, I'm not here for it. Not because I don't love you, but because that's not the way my brain tends to work, right? So that leads to all kinds of conflict. And then there's more. There's, once we're there and once we're in it, now we have an anatomical gap that can't be overstated. And most people, in particular most modern young people who've gotten most of their information from the internet, don't know how wide the divide is. The average fully viable man, which is to say from like 18 to early 70s, needs between 90 seconds and 3 minutes to become fully aroused. The average woman needs between 12 and 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And there's science behind this. It's got nothing to do with whether or not she wants to be in a particular place faster. Anybody have any idea why that is? Like, why does it take women longer? The reason is that for women to have sex is a profound act of hospitality. No, I mean this. Women don't walk around ready to have sex. All evidence to the contrary in the public imagination. The public imagination would have you believe that women just walk around with like a hole that's just waiting to be filled. It's not true. When women are not engaged in this activity, if you were to take a cross-section of what they look like, it's like this. It's totally flat. It's not a monolithic tube that we carry around. It's a series of cross-hatched muscles. And the reality is, to create space to invite a man in requires this complex interplay of multiple organ systems. Arousal for women involves the uterus going up and in, and as it does, it pulls back all those overlapping muscles, making a space that wasn't there before. So when women create or men impose upon their wives this expectation of 90 seconds to 3 minutes because that's the pacing that makes sense for them, they do so in glaring ignorance and with no knowledge of why a woman couldn't be there if she wanted to. And then when we don't listen to those systems, now we have women that rip, that tear, that have pain, that have discomfort, that have all kinds of stuff. And all the time, they're thinking they're broken, and he's thinking they're frigid, and it leads to all this strife, and it leads to all this conflict, and it leads to this perception that we're not partners on the same team. But the reality is, most women make it to marriage not knowing 12 to 20 minutes. But wait, there's more. The average man, once we get there, again, sadly needs 90 seconds to 3 minutes once we get going to completion. And the average woman needs 7.5 to 12. We got a math problem. We got a big math problem. And if we don't know how to talk about the math problem, we can have all kinds of hurt feelings, felt perceptions that my partner doesn't desire me, felt perceptions that my partner doesn't want to be in it with me, that they don't love me, that they don't care about me, or self-doubt that maybe I don't love them enough, maybe I don't desire, maybe I don't, right? Like this flows in both directions. And it's unspeakably cruel to send people into marriage or to sustain marriage not having any context for talking about any of these things. And then lastly, there's the meta-analysis of how men and women think about sex so differently, we can't even stand it. So if we contemplate approaches to what is sex in a marriage, men, broadly speaking, think that, okay, so this is my married life with my partner, right? My married life over time, right? My finances are going to go like this. My parenting's going to go like this. Well, the one stable thing, that's going to be the sex life. That's just going to be like nice, steady, let's just keep no use in adding more volatility here, right? This is the way a man thinks about sex over time. It's like this is just a solidarity we can have day in, day out, week in, week out, in a life that is already very, very complex and volatile. Women, on the other hand, and I think justifiably so, because it does require a laying aside of the multitasking and thinking. It does require a tremendous embodiment of hospitality that is energetically and emotively expensive. Women think sex is the outpouring and the culmination of what I naturally want to do when everything else is going well. So women are like, man, this is what naturally makes sense to me when I'm feeling emotionally bonded to you and we know where the money's going and we're in lockstep on the parent. Like when we're a team in all these ways, then I naturally, natively, and organically want to meet you in this way. It just pours forth out of me when we've got all that unity. But when they're not in that place, they have to work really, really hard to meet their husbands in this very different place. Now, one's not right, one's not wrong. But I mean, it's a conversation that kind of needs to happen, right? So I know that's like a long excursus we just took, but here's what I want to say. When we look at courting couples and we look at married couples inside the church, sexual integrity looks a whole lot less. I mean, we should have accountability for watching porn and fidelity and all those other things. But here's what I want to say. We hyperfixate on those things, and we do so to the detriment of focusing on the flourishing aspects, right? Like, when's the last time in a men's group it was like, yeah, we had an accountability session on stewarding our sex lives, and we were really holding one another accountable for having open, constructive, thoughtful conversations so we can understand what our wife needs. We focus so much on what we shouldn't be doing that nobody's educating, informing, coming alongside, and creating accountability for the positive thing we could be doing. Because you know, one of the things that makes pornography or infidelity a whole lot less appealing is having a wife that's really excited to connect with you, eager even, right? And having a sense of how that's done in a balanced way, a nuanced and collaborative way. That makes all that other stuff a whole lot less appealing. And I think mostly we don't know how to have that dialogue. So we kind of beat the one drum of don't. But the thing is, as somebody that does the work I do, I can tell you that don't, it doesn't work. They end up in my office because porn, because erotica, because kink, because infidelity, because non-monogamy, because all of the ways that if we can't feel well met, we get squirrely, and we get squirrely fast. Even people inside the church do. And I think we just would rather not acknowledge that felt rejection over lengths of time in this area of life almost never goes unanswered. If I feel like I can't win, I start finding a way to make a win. And then we get really super judgy on the person that did the bad thing, but we are so blind and tone deaf to the fact that there was no front-end accountability to the person that wasn't coming to the table. We didn't hold them accountable at any phase along the way. Now, I'm not saying a partner abandoning the marital bed in any way legitimizes bad action on the part of the other partner. What I'm saying is, we're so dead set focusing on what not to do, we on the front end set people up for failure by not having accountability in the things we should be doing. So the reason why we're not out there mixing it up in the area of sexual integrity is because we don't have hot, holy marriages of our own that we're excited to talk about. And so there's no other alternative example out there. sexual integrity looks a lot like pursuing a healthy, whole, thriving connection of your own, and then being educated and informed and open enough in posture that people in your orbit can talk to you about it. So you can have that conversation where you say, here's what's life-giving about doing it this way. Because if we don't, nobody else will. Now with that, I will take your questions. If you need to write them down, we can do it later. It's fine.
Talk about, like, for younger people starting to date, the difference, or it might be better to use courtship, but I was just wondering what's the difference between.
So, courtship is set within the context of an. It's not, so dating historically, or actually dating in the last 50 years has largely been, I find you interesting, you find me interesting, so we're gonna go be alone together. Yeah, so courtship is, oh, you think you might find that person interesting, okay. Well, you should talk to your dad or your elder or a trusted older brother, and you should say, hey, what do you think of that guy? That guy a good guy? Why don't you get up in that guy's business? Why don't you go vet that guy for me? Why don't you go like really sort of like scrutinize that guy and tell me if that guy is worth my time? Like you don't even start. And then if some guy's like, hey, like I think you're nice, that is absolutely awesome. That's like I'm really flattered, think that's great. So these are the men I need you to talk to, and we'll see what they say. So instead of you as a lone ranger going off there based on what? Attraction and social cleverness, asking the question, is this person a good life partner? What you do is you contextualize that inside of a broad community that is interested in a good match, that is mutual, that is engaging in a process that leads the two of you to an outcome that, whether you end up together or not, leads to your best future potential. Because when we look at premarital sex and we look at cohabitation before marriage, we actually find that the try before you buy model is not accurate. Actually, people and couples that engage in cohabitation and premarital sex are less stable, they have higher divorce rates, and they have lower marital satisfaction rates. So what it is it's a model where the community vets mutually, as opposed to you going off on your own and kind of in that very much every romantic comedy you've ever seen, like the two of us are just gonna figure out if we had that spark. Yeah. Getting crickets over here.
I'll ask questions. I don't need to see this later. Okay, so,
If you don't want to use the microphone for every question, that's also
no, I don't. Height people online, it's not working. Hi, my question is, could you please give us an example about a dialogue that one might have about sexual topics during a fellowship meal?
Well, so I might be the wrong person to ask because I'm inclined to just rip that Band-Aid off, right? But let me say this about that. I think that there are ways people will indicate to you that they want to have a conversation that might be slightly awkward or slightly uncomfortable. Or you might have to go first. Right? I'm struggling to have this dialogue, or I recently had this dialogue and I was surprised at how hard it was for me to be transparent and honest, right? Or even like a great entry point is if you're an adult, you can talk with other adults about talking to your kids. This is a great lead into having other conversations, right? Talking to kids has its own, right? Like there's age appropriateness, there's a lot to be considered. So I think if it's somebody, I mean like with me, I'm not making this up. I can be in line with my kids to get takeout pizza, and people within the broader community, because they know what I do, can be like, hey, can I talk to you for a quick sec? And every time they're like, can I talk to you for a quick sec? I'm like, first of all, this ain't gonna be a quick second. And probably no, not while getting pizza. Like, this is not the time or the place to park that. Like, I have empathy, but like, you need more than a quick sec, brother. So if you're not me, chances are good you don't have people outing that. So what I would say is, you go first. And then I would say you can start conceptually, and that's a way to move in safely. Right? So I've been reading books about, I've been studying, I recently learned about the anatomy of, these things are less fraught, but they can lead to and be an invitation towards. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I do this with my kids. You know, we've been bringing library books home that have twisted sexual views. It's very common, kids' comics all over the place. And so I got to share with my child, thank you for respecting this and bringing this to my attention, because, I could share based on my own past, falling into reading smut books when I was a teen. And, it doesn't happen immediately, but it's gradual that you start picking this up. And, written porn is just the next, it's
still porn.
It's still porn. And so I was warning my child about this. So I can see that could be easy to do at a fellowship meal. It could be, people are talking about particular titles and be like, oh, but did you notice this relationship that was happening?
And I had this conversation with my kid, or I had this series. Yeah, I think that there are slow starts to these conversations. And here's what I will say. I think like any change in a community, the reality is, it's not like everybody overnight is gonna bust into their fellowship meal ready to talk about all the stuff like, that's not reasonable, that's not even desirable. But here's what I can say, you can take that one brave conversation or make that one more open comment. You can, right, like you can ask yourself, how closed off am I in this way? And what would it look like to be 2 degrees more open? I don't expect everybody to be me. I mean, and I need a job, so I don't want all of, like, I got kids to feed. Like, I mean, and also some of these things do require, like, a tremendous amount of anatomy and physiology. Like, some of it's, like, super technical, and not everybody needs to have that degree, but, like, that degree more of openness where it's like, yeah, I struggled, or early on in our marriage, or these are the ways that we create like a sense that there's another way that you can do it safely is relaying a past conversation that you had with somebody, not them. That's a safe way to do it, because then you're sharing, but you're not saying like you need a new conversation. You're saying, I had a really good conversation and it was really helpful because, and then you can share with them like a quick takeaway. Like, I never realized ABC. That was really cool to know. I was like, oh, that makes sense. And then it's not threatening like you're expecting them to answer you, because that can be awkward.
Yeah, the context is like we give our kids sex ed regularly. Yeah. Anybody who's older than, well, even the 4-year, when we have little kids, it's all based on their level of understanding, and this is helpful for them because they need to know it's God's gift. Sexuality is for marriage, and it's wonderful, and but it has a context.
Yeah.
It's not for this time. It's not for children. We don't talk about crushes or boyfriends or whatever. If you're not old enough to get married, then this is not the time. But anyway, so that's in that context. But yet, there's something. I have another question, but I'll let people have a turn.
I think more of a comment, what you're talking about. There was an event we went to, and my husband and I got childcare, and then the people were like, oh, how was your time together? And we're like, hey, we actually got time together. And it was just dead silent. And we're like, high five. And husband and I high fived. And we're just, I think it's also normalizing the fact that it's a good thing. And sometimes I think in our culture too, we talk about sex in such a negative way. It doesn't mean that there aren't problems. I mean, transparent, went through infertility and recent year ago miscarriage. There's grief with sexual things too, and that's hard
Yeah.
too.
I actually think one of the things that you're illuminating is this is another point of entry. A lot of times a great lead in to having a more transparent dialogue about sex and sex-related things is, and this I think is a travesty, but it is true, we're much more comfortable and we feel safer talking about sex-related things that don't involve pleasure. So it's a whole lot easier to fellowship meal to be like, yeah, because of the miscarriages and because of the pain associated, there was a time when I really struggled because I didn't want to go through that pain again. And so I had a conflicted or ambivalent relationship towards sexually engaging and the idea of pregnancy again. Like that made that whole area fraught. People are much more comfortable starting there than they are with like, oh, so recently, having learned about those time differentials and putting that into use, things are going better. I mean, now, let me be clear, I actually think that that's a valid dialogue to have. I'm not saying it's a bad dialogue to have. You need a context. Like, that's probably not like while you're, watching kids in the nursery, there's context to everything. But I think we should be normalizing, like, that's great. Somebody should high-five you. That's exciting. I am happy for you, right? And we should be happy for one another. We should be like, more joy is better. The marriage bed's undefiled, friends. Like, go forth, and joy is good. But I think sometimes if we start with the struggles, what we do is we sort of like dip the toe in, and before you know it, we can like sort of end up wasting. So sometimes starting with stuff that's easier, just contextually, is a great way to sort of move in. But then once you start repeatedly moving in, you can start to acclimate. And I think that's a useful tool.
All right, so I want to contrast this with the worldly view, like on sitcoms where people are bringing their bedroom activity out and they're like, oh, my wife's so hot, blah, blah, bragging on this as being an exposition of her. It's exposing her like so that he can
almost
get
like
glory.
Exhibitionism.
Yes, Mr. Nebuchadnezzar with his Vashti says, come out here so I can show you off. And she's like, no.
Around.
Yeah, and please contrast that, or diminishing, like, I can't get anything from my spouse, and complaining about your sexual relationship to others casually. Like, the world does this for jokes, and so maybe we're taking the extreme view, but will you address how to cover each other rather than expose each other?
So again, I think one of the things that we can do is reference the other talk where we talked about like that triangulation, right? If you are having a real genuine issue with your spouse, you need to start by having the conversation with them. And if you don't know how to have it, you're concerned that it won't go well, you're struggling to know how to articulate it, the thrust of that conversation is not going to be complaint, it's going to be, I need resource so that I can engage in my end of this thing well. Can you help me resource? So the query isn't about my frigid wife. The query is, I'm confused about how we got to this place, and I'm struggling to think how I would bring that up constructively. Can you help me think that through? Because that's different than like, well, my old ball and chain who's just never in the, right? Like, you know what I mean? I think when you're looking to have these dialogues constructively, it's not going to by and large play as, or in point of fact be, the uncovering the nakedness of your partner. If anything, if you are doing it well, thoughtfully, and constructively, it will be you humbly acknowledging what you don't know, what you are afraid of, what you are intimidated by, right? Like, so the way you do it really, really, really matters, right? And I think in a secular context, what we do is we find the cheap shot and the trite joke, right? About frigidness or about the hotness, right? When you're trying to have a constructive conversation with other people of this same faith, you're going to be having the conversation that is geared towards help me be the best on my side of this equation that I can, and help me think through how to bring out the best in my partner. Is that helpful?
Yes, but I'm trying to think about like privacy versus like where does privacy come in?
Well, so
I consider sex to be a private relationship, and so I'm trying to interact with your ideas.
okay, so
Where that comes
So I think there are a couple things that we want to consider. So some is a temperament-based issue. Some people are naturally more private than others. Some people are more naturally like not interested in sharing the details of their thing. And other people are more comfortable with being known, like the transparency is okay with them. So if that's not something that feels natural to you, you don't necessarily have to give details, but here's how you can still be accessible in a congregational or communal context. You can be open to discussing principles and ideas. You can be open to talking about past things that don't vet or out you currently or your partner, your real-time, real space present partner, right? If that feels too close and claustrophobic to you, you can talk about historical thoughts, struggles, learning those kinds of things. The other thing you can do, and I do this a lot, and I think it's a really useful tool, is instead of sharing from the first person, you can share in a moderated format. I do this all the time because a lot of the content that I cover in public speaking is extracted from gobs and gobs and gobs of stories from clients I see, but some of it is drawn from my family. Some of it's drawn from my extended family. Okay, so if you're doing that, you don't have to be like, my cousin, right? What you could do is be like, you know, I heard of a woman who, right? And sometimes the I heard of a woman is you, right? You don't have to be, and quite frankly, in certain contexts, being first person is weird. It's gonna give people the ick, right? Like, this is like your kids there are things your kids do not wanna know. Like, they wanna know in general, but like, no kid wants to hear their mom being like, Dad. Nobody wants to hear that, right? Like, there's a genetic thing that's like, I mean, in principle, they want to know that mom and dad really love each other and that feels tight and solid. And when they get older, they'll realize that this is part of it. But like, ain't no 13-year-old boy want to, okay, so you can moderate, and that's a great way to convey content and have an open posture to the dialogue without feeling like you're airing your not dirty laundry, right? You might not want to do that, but there are ways to do that I think are constructive and thoughtful. And then the other thing is degrees of intimacy, right? When I was talking in my speech about accountability for single folks, I don't think every single person should be able to go up to anybody in the congregation and be like, so let me tell you what's going on with me. I think that there's concentric rings, right? There's a broad awareness and broad support. And then, you got one or two folks in the congregation that have granular awareness. Is that helpful? Are we?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're supposed to stop at 1, and so we want to give you some time, and us some time to get the questions together. So we'll get back here at 2, although the schedule says 1:45, to give us a little bit more time. So this is just hangout time. So hang out. If you have any questions, this is like your last chance to put them in, so please do that. And then, yeah, come back. Oh, thank you so much
What?
for speaking for us.
Oh, thank you.